There are moments in life when a single act of cruelty changes everything, not just for the person who suffers it, but for everyone who witnesses it and chooses to stay silent. Imagine being 17 years old, standing in the rain outside your school, your clothes soaked, your books slipping from your hands, and three people deciding that your pain is entertainment. No warning, no reason that makes sense, just laughter, hands gripping your arms, and the cold ground rushing up to meet you as your world is dragged through the mud in front of dozens of watching eyes. This is not fiction. This is a pattern repeated in schools across America, where humiliation becomes a public performance and silence becomes complicity. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name wasn't important to them back then, which is exactly why it matters now. For the sake of this story, we'll call her Emily Carter, a quiet girl growing up in a mid-sized American town where appearances mattered more than truth. Emily didn't come from money, and in a place where status quietly shaped everything from friendships to opportunities, that alone placed her at the bottom of an unspoken hierarchy. Her mother worked long shifts at a diner, often coming home too exhausted to speak, and her father had been out of the picture for years. Emily learned early how to stay out of the way, how to keep her voice low, how to avoid becoming the center of attention. But in environments built on dominance and control, staying invisible rarely keeps you safe for long. It simply delays the moment someone decides to make you visible for all the wrong reasons. The group that targeted her didn't start out as villains in their own minds. They were popular, well-connected, admired by teachers, followed on social media, and protected by the quiet influence of families who held weight in the community. At the center was Vanessa Reed, confident, articulate, and accustomed to getting her way without resistance. Around her were girls like Chloe Bennett and Riley Adams, each playing their role in maintaining the image of control and superiority that defined their social circle. What began as small comments in hallways, subtle jabs disguised as jokes, and deliberate exclusion slowly escalated into something more public, more physical, more damaging. And as it escalated, something equally important happened. The people around them adjusted, normalized it, and chose not to intervene. The day everything changed was not dramatic at first glance. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that sends students rushing toward exits with their heads down and their minds focused on getting home. Emily was doing exactly that when she crossed paths with Vanessa and her friends near the side gate, a place unofficially understood to belong to a certain crowd. The exchange began with a simple remark, followed by laughter, and then a decision was made in a matter of seconds. Hands grabbed her arms. Her resistance was minimal, not because she accepted it, but because she had learned resistance often made things worse. Her bag fell, books scattered, and she was dragged across wet ground while phones came out and voices filled the air. Some people laughed. Some looked away. A few hesitated, then kept walking. No one stopped it. What happened next didn't make headlines. There was no official report that captured the full weight of the moment, no viral outrage that demanded accountability. Instead, the footage circulated quietly among students, becoming a source of entertainment rather than concern. Emily went home that day carrying more than physical bruises. There is a specific kind of damage that comes from being humiliated in public, especially at an age where identity is still forming and belonging feels essential. It doesn't just hurt, it reshapes how you see yourself, how you interpret the world, and what you believe you deserve. That night, sitting on the floor of a small apartment while her mother rested in the next room, Emily faced a decision that would define the rest of her life, though no one else would know it at the time. There is a misconception that turning points always look dramatic in the moment, but often they are quiet, almost invisible to anyone but the person experiencing them. Emily didn't make a speech, didn't confront her attackers, didn't suddenly transform overnight. What she did was far less visible and far more powerful. She made a commitment to herself, not based on revenge but on control. She wrote down a single sentence in a notebook that had been damaged in the rain, a sentence about building a life where no one would ever have the power to treat her that way again. It wasn't about becoming stronger in the way people often imagine. It was about becoming untouchable in a system that had once dismissed her entirely. In the months that followed, the bullying didn't disappear. In some ways, it intensified, because once someone is identified as a target, patterns tend to repeat. But something had shifted internally. Emily began waking up earlier, studying longer, and spending time in places where she could access knowledge without judgment: libraries, online resources, anywhere she could learn without interruption. While others focused on maintaining social status, she focused on building skills. She became disciplined in a way that didn't draw attention, consistent in a way that didn't require validation. And perhaps most importantly, she stopped seeking approval from the very environment that had rejected her, which freed her to grow without being constrained by it. After graduation, the gap between perception and reality widened even further. On the surface, it looked like the same hierarchy continued. Vanessa and her friends moved forward with confidence, supported by networks and expectations that suggested success was inevitable. Emily, on the other hand, entered a world that offered no guarantees. She took on entry-level work, balanced multiple responsibilities, and continued her education through whatever means were available. There were setbacks, rejections, and moments where the weight of everything felt overwhelming. But the absence of comfort had given her something else: resilience that didn't depend on circumstances, and focus that wasn't easily shaken by external opinions. Over time, patterns began to emerge that would eventually separate her path from the others in ways no one could have predicted. Emily developed a deep understanding of business operations, not from theory alone, but from observing systems up close, identifying inefficiencies, and learning how decisions affected outcomes. She paid attention to what others overlooked, asked questions that others avoided, and took calculated risks when opportunities presented themselves. What started as small roles gradually evolved into positions of greater responsibility. And then, at a certain point, she made a decision that would change everything. She chose to build something of her own rather than continue contributing to structures created by others. The early stages were difficult, as they often are. Without significant financial backing or established connections, progress was slow and uncertain. But Emily approached it with the same discipline that had carried her through years of being underestimated. She focused on value, on solving real problems, on building something that could sustain itself rather than relying on perception alone. Gradually, traction developed. Clients returned, results spoke for themselves, and what had once seemed like an unlikely path began to take shape as a legitimate enterprise. As the business grew, so did her reputation, not based on image, but on performance and consistency over time. Meanwhile, the trajectories of those who once held power over her began to shift in less visible ways. The confidence that had been supported by external validation faced challenges when real-world consequences entered the picture. Decisions carried weight, outcomes mattered, and the absence of deeper preparation became more apparent. Vanessa, Chloe, and Riley each encountered their own struggles: financial pressures, unstable opportunities, and the realization that influence in one environment does not automatically translate into success in another. These changes didn't happen all at once, but over time, the contrast between perception and reality became impossible to ignore. Years later, circumstances aligned in a way that brought these separate paths back into direct contact. A growing company, now recognized within its industry, announced a series of hearing opportunities that attracted a wide range of applicants. Among them were individuals looking for stability, for a chance to rebuild, for access to something they no longer had. Vanessa and her friends applied, driven by necessity rather than confidence, unaware of a detail that would soon redefine their understanding of the past. When they arrived for the interview, expectations were cautious but hopeful, until the moment the decision-maker entered the room. Recognition is a powerful experience, especially when it occurs in a context where roles have been completely reversed. Emily walked in not as the person they once dismissed, but as the person whose approval now determined their immediate future. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no attempt to revisit every detail of what had happened years earlier. Instead, there was a controlled, measured interaction that reflected the difference between reacting and responding. She reviewed their applications, asked questions, and listened carefully, not to expose them, but to understand who they had become since the time their paths first crossed. The decision she made was not driven by emotion in the way people might expect. It was informed by perspective, by the understanding that power is best demonstrated through restraint rather than retaliation. She offered them positions, not at the level they might have once assumed they deserved, but at a starting point that required effort, accountability, and growth. It was an opportunity, but not an easy one, and certainly not one influenced by past social status. In that moment, the dynamic was clear, not because she reminded them of it, but because they could see it for themselves. What followed was not a story of instant redemption or dramatic transformation, but of gradual realization. Working within an environment where performance mattered more than perception required adjustment, reflection, and in some cases, humility. The same system that had once overlooked Emily now operated under principles she had helped shape, principles that prioritized contribution over image and consistency over popularity. And while the past could not be undone, the present offered a chance to move forward differently, something that had not been available to her when she needed it most. Looking back, the moment in the rain was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a process that unfolded over years, shaped by choices made in private rather than actions taken in public. It serves as a reminder that the roles people occupy at one point in life are not fixed, and that the way someone is treated during their most vulnerable moments can have consequences far beyond what anyone anticipates. It also highlights a more uncomfortable truth, that systems often allow harm to continue not because it goes unnoticed, but because it is tolerated. And as this story comes to a close, the most important question isn't about what happened to Emily or those who once targeted her. It's about the environments we participate in and the choices we make within them. Because every moment where someone is humiliated, ignored, or dismissed presents an opportunity to either reinforce that pattern or interrupt it. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think in a different way, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next.